The idea of alt-gospels has captured many imaginations over the past few decades. This has been fueled in part by sensational media coverage of documents such as the Gospel of Judas. I have a video on my companion channel surveying this landscape. Hype and spin bring popular interest to a topic that would otherwise be dominated by dry academic debating. But with all the fuss, it's easy to overinflate or otherwise misunderstand the importance of these offbeat texts. So here I'll suggest 10 quick corrections to things people get wrong about the non-canonical Gospels. For the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to ignore those documents that are likely out-and-out forgeries. I'm thinking, for instance, of the secret Gospel of Mark, peddled by Morton Smith, or the so-called Gospel of Jesus' Wife, promoted by Karen King. Additionally, each of the topics I touch upon could and should probably have dedicated presentations of their own. This is necessarily selective. And unlike the other videos that I create for my other channel, this is decidedly more opinionated. Because of time limitations, it's also less visually complex. With that said, 10 major errors people make regarding the Apocryphal Gospels. Number 1, they have nothing to do with the Dead Sea Scrolls. First, let's clear up a few misconceptions about the subject. It is now well known that there were many fascinating discoveries, collectively termed the Dead Sea Scrolls, in caves located near the Palestinian town of Qumran. For the most part, the texts unearthed there all pertain in one way or other to the religion of Judaism. Some manuscripts contain passages from the Hebrew Bible, which Bible Christians refer to as the Old Testament. Others, including the books of Enoch, Jubilees, Sirach, and Tobit, were works produced during the period when Israel had its Second Temple. Since Christianity emerged out of a broadly Judaic context, in a sense, anything having to do with pre-Christian Judaism has some relevance as part of Christianity's seedbed. So you could say that the Dead Sea Scrolls are indirectly related to Christianity. But there have been no explicitly Christian documents found at Qumran. Therefore, the Dead Sea Scrolls do not have direct bearing on Christianity. Rather, when we speak of Apocryphal Gospels, we're talking about texts that were located elsewhere, including Egyptian cities like Akhmim, Nag Hammadi, and Oxyrhynchus. Number 2, many are not Gospels in the usual sense. To explain this, let's get clear on some vocabulary. The Bible as we know it divides roughly into 2 parts. The first part, called the Old Testament, as noted a moment ago, is more or less the Hebrew Bible. It begins with the 5 books of Moses, called the Pentateuch, and tells the story of the ancient nation of Israel. The second part, called the New Testament, begins with 4 Gospels and tells the story of Jesus Christ and the origination of the Christian church. The 4 Gospels are the Gospel according to Matthew, the Gospel according to Mark, the Gospel of Luke, and John's Gospel. Several concepts and vocabulary words come to us from so-called critical scholarship. This branch of academia is fraught with conflict and controversy. We'll say a bit more about it as we go along. But for now, we'll note that since about the early 19th century, Matthew, Mark, and Luke collectively have been termed the Synoptic Gospels. Synoptic means viewed together, and carries the sense that these 3 Gospels have a shared perspective, which is routinely contrasted against the Gospel of John. The word gospel derives from the Greek euangelion, meaning good news. This word, in the anglicized form evangelical, shows up in conservative circles within Protestant Christianity. Thus, the first books of the New Testament are called Gospels because Christians regard Jesus' life and death as decidedly good news for humanity. The idea is that we are born into a condition of slavery to sin, and Jesus paid the price of his own life to redeem us, that is, to buy our freedom. Each of the 4 biblical Gospels narrates select aspects of the life of Jesus of Nazareth. Collectively, they give special attention to his roughly 3 years of public ministry, and they culminate with his execution by the Roman government and his subsequent resurrection from the dead, establishing, according to the New Testament, that God the Father had accepted Jesus' sacrifice. Many of the non-canonical works contain only some of the elements that I just listed, and a few, like the Gospel of Thomas, contain virtually none. The Gospel of Thomas is merely a collection of 114 sayings attributed to Jesus. There is no clear overarching narrative at all. Therefore, if Thomas is a gospel, it's quite different from what you'll get in the Bible. Of course, this divergence is part of what has sparked considerable interest. The idea is that these texts, which are not found in the New Testament, represent alternative portrayals of Jesus. To put it another way, the picture they give of early Christianity is distinct from what became mainline Catholicism. Consequently, these texts are frequently called Apocryphal Gospels. But this leads to a further confusion. Number 3. The word Apocrypha is ambiguous. One meaning of the word seems to have arisen in tandem with the Protestant Reformation. On this usage, the word designates 7 Old Testament books that are found in Catholic Bibles, but which were dropped from most Protestant Bibles. These disputed books, sometimes called the Deuterocanon by Catholics, are Tobit, Judith, 1 Maccabees, 2 Maccabees, Wisdom, also called the Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, also known as Ecclesiasticus, and Baruch. The point at issue is that these 7 books, along with portions of Esther and Daniel, were either not originally written in Hebrew, or at least have no surviving Hebrew manuscripts. Instead, they were included in a volume of Jewish scriptures called the Septuagint, abbreviated LXX, or also called the Greek Old Testament. Septuagint means 70. And refers to the story that the translation was originally produced by 70 or 72 Hebrew scholars. When humanist Renaissance thinkers, including Bible translators, began poring over original language manuscripts, the discrepancy between Old Testament books that were available in Greek and those that were available in Hebrew became a major issue. Protestants hewed closely to the Jewish Bible as it took shape sometime between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD. They rejected the 7 books and relegated them to the status of Apocrypha. By this, they seemed principally to deny that the books were inspired scripture. On the other hand, Catholics were quite happy to follow the Septuagint. They pointed out that Jesus and the writers of the New Testament had apparently quoted the Septuagint extensively, and thereby seemed to affirm its authority. Now, second meaning for Apocrypha came a bit later, sometime between the late 16th and early 18th centuries. On this second definition, apocryphal means being of doubtful authorship. For example, the biblical Philip was a 1st century apostle who was held traditionally to have been martyred, that is, killed because of his faith. However, most scholars suppose that the Gospel of Philip was composed sometime during the 3rd century. These 2 facts would entail that the eponymous Gospel was not actually written by the historical Philip. Thus, it is apocryphal in the second sense. Another term, basically synonymous in this context, is pseudepigraphal. This means falsely ascribed and underscores the deliberate substitution of the name of the true author of a text for another name. This phenomenon of attaching a different name to a document other than that of its real author assumes a few further things. Chief among these is that the text had to have been written after the life of the claimed author. Here's an example apart from the Apocryphal Gospels. In the book of the Acts of the Apostles in the New Testament, we read about a 1st century Athenian judge and Christian convert named Dionysius. Years later, around the 5th or 6th centuries, a work appeared blending Neoplatonism and Christianity and bearing the name Dionysius the Areopagite. The work became popular in some academic quarters because it was falsely believed that it had in fact been written by the disciple of St. Paul that we read about in the New Testament. Since the 19th century, the anonymous author has been known instead as Pseudo-Dionysius, underscoring the fanciful and non-veridical nature of the authorship claim. The prevailing hypothesis is that the true author was an otherwise unremarkable Syrian monk. The operative assumption is thus that the author believed his work would be taken more seriously if he associated it with a personality who would be more widely known and presumably therefore more authoritative. So too with the Apocryphal Gospels. Remember first that we're not talking about a real-life author writing under a pen name or pseudonym. We're talking about an author associating his or her work with a real-life figure. If you were going to fabricate such an authorship claim, such as writing a book of sayings yourself, but then publishing it under the byline Benjamin Franklin, the person you select, number 1, would have to be seen as a plausible candidate for being an authority on the subject being written about. But also, number 2, the person would likely have to be dead, and therefore unable to dispute the claim. And this point leads us on to number 4. For the most part, the Apocryphal Gospels were written after the canonical Gospels. If the falsely ascribed author had to be both dead or even long dead. And if he had to have had time to become well known enough for the genuine writer to bother trying to exploit the false author's name and reputation, then we would expect these sorts of documents to appear later. That is, later than the texts that introduce the more famous characters. Now that's a complicated series of ideas. Let's try to unpack it using an example. We see that there's a gospel attributed to Mary. Now it's not 100% certain that this was a reference to Mary Magdalene, but many scholars believe that it is. So let's go with that. It's obvious that we're faced with two initial possibilities. Either the Gospel of Mary was composed by the actual historical Mary Magdalene, or it wasn't. Most analysts so far have concluded that it was composed sometime during the 2nd century. Now, since the canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, introduce the person of Mary Magdalene, and since they were 1st century documents, she was obviously a 1st century figure. If she knew Jesus and was there when Jesus died, say around the year AD 33, plus or minus a few years, she would have to have been born no later than AD 20, even if she had barely been a teenager at the time of the crucifixion. Now, if we assume that the Gospel of Mary goes back to the mid-2nd century, sometime between AD 130 and 170, then minimally, she would have to have been 110 to 150 years old if she wrote it herself. And if she was closer to Jesus' age, she would have been even older than that. So the probabilities favor the view that someone simply attached Mary's name to the gospel for its cachet. This point has a few important ramifications. For example, the Gospel of Mary portrays Mary in the role of an apostle. She's also depicted as the sole custodian of God's special revelation. Assuming that the woman is intended to have been Mary Magdalene, it's clear that these are radical departures from the scattered comments about her found in the New Testament. For one thing, in the Bible, all 12 apostles are males, and if any one of them is singled out as having had a special leadership role, it would have been Peter. Despite these glaring differences, the Gospel of Mary is arguably demonstrably derivative. Consider that even in the Gospel of Mary, Mary's testimony is inadmissible without Peter's introduction. In other words, notwithstanding the elevated place the Gospel gives to Mary, the Gospel of Mary nevertheless, in a roundabout way, appears to confirm Peter's authority. This sort of evidence suggests that many of the apocryphal writings depend on and derive from the familiar 4 Gospels. Number 5. Some oft-repeated claims rest on tendentious assumptions. Dating a text is an admittedly speculative affair, and speculations are perforce based on assumptions. It's worth examining some of the relevant assumptions then. For example, some theorize that the Gospel of Thomas is comparatively early. Specifically, a few scholars have suggested that it may even have been written before the 4 Gospels in the New Testament. One assumption used to justify this conclusion is the thought that, all things being equal, considering related texts, shorter documents are more likely to be earlier than longer ones. For instance, within critical Bible scholarship, there's something termed the synoptic problem. The gist is an attempt on the part of academics to reconstruct the process by which Matthew, Mark, and Luke were assumed to have been written. A focus is laid upon trying to identify source material, including a hypothetical early document that has been labeled Q, after the German word for source, Quelle. Without getting too deep into the weeds, numerous critics assume that even amongst the Synoptic Gospels themselves, there is an obvious interdependence. So, in order to explain the similarities, without invoking the idea of divine inspiration, we're often running in a game of who borrowed from whom. If you thought meteorologists had cushy jobs getting paid for being wrong, you should become a synoptic scholar. One of the primary theories in this regard is termed Markan priority. On this view, the Gospel of Mark was written first. It was then used as a source by the authors of Matthew and Luke. Now, why think Mark came first? Proponents of the Markan theory have their reasons, and they fill journal articles with them. But chief among them is the assumption we just stated. Mark is the shortest of the 4 Gospels, therefore, it probably came first. 17th century French polymath Blaise Pascal once apologized to the recipient of one of his provincial letters, writing in effect, "I'm sorry this text is so long, I didn't have time to make it shorter." This tongue-in-cheek remark highlights an important point. Early documents are sometimes lengthier than later ones. This isn't universally true, of course, but it certainly applies to many rough and final drafts. And that, in effect, is the problem. length comparisons alone cannot conclusively establish which of two similar texts is earlier. Now, you may think that the example doesn't apply to different texts, like Matthew, Mark, and Luke. But this, first of all, misses the essence of the synoptic problem as academics conceive of it. They hold that the documents are so similar to one another that there's bound to be some satisfying way of analyzing which text was original and which borrowed from it. So if you don't like the word draft, think instead of a digest, like taking the longer Summa Theologia from Thomas Aquinas and condensing it down into a student edition. In fact, this is exactly what St. Augustine seems to have said about the issue. After noting the received view that the Gospel of Matthew came first, he says, quote, "Mark seems to have followed closely after him, like someone following on his footsteps and abbreviating him," end quote. Or again, according to liturgical historians, the traditional Catholic so-called High Mass preceded its Low Mass counterpart, despite the latter being shorter. The longer form came first. The upshot is this. The assumption that shorter length texts precede longer form documents is reasonable, but it has numerous counterexamples. So, the Gospel of Thomas may not be earlier than the four Gospels after all. But at least the assumption of length is theologically neutral. To put it another way, it doesn't beg the question or even take sides in any obvious way between the all-important and controversial debate between theism and atheism. Not so other assumptions. For example, if you Google, "When was the Gospel of Mark written?" the top search result at the time of this writing suggests that it could not have been written before the year AD 70. Why not? The Gospel of Mark mentions the destruction of the Jewish temple, and historians relate that the destruction of the temple occurred in or around AD 70. Why should mention of the historical fact about the temple imply that the Gospel of Mark couldn't have been written earlier than 70 AD? The unspoken assumption is that the author of Mark could not possibly have known about the destruction of the Jewish temple until after it occurred. Never mind that in the Gospel of Mark, the information is represented as a prophetic word from God. The destruction is presented in the Gospel as a yet-to-be-fulfilled prediction, not a fait accompli. What's going on? Simply stated, many Bible scholars assume that there is no such thing as genuine prophecy. Many of the contentious assumptions, like the one just canvassed, may all be subsumed under the heading naturalism. This is not the place to do a deep dive into that worldview. Suffice it to say that naturalism is, in this context, functionally equivalent to atheism, that is, the view that there is no God. It is thus the antithesis of supernaturalism, which, for our purposes, we'll treat as synonymous with theism, or the view that there is a God. The point is that too frequently, Bible scholars are not neutrally marshaling evidence for or against the existence of God. Rather, they are assuming a posture of atheism, or theism, and then simply working on that basis. It shouldn't be surprising, then, that naturalistic analysts produce theories that militate against traditional faith perspectives. But it's not like these theories they produce are ipso facto evidence against traditional faith perspectives. Rather, they're simply elaborations of an antecedently assumed contrary point of view. Once we have identified these debatable assumptions, distancing ourselves from the entire critical enterprise is arguably justifiable. But it's worth pointing out that we may assess a worldview both internally for coherence and logical consistency, as well as externally for how well it fits the facts, insofar as those can be established without circularity. At its most basic level, textual criticism requires texts to analyze. And this leads us to point number 6. The overall textual evidence for the Apocryphal Gospels is comparatively poor. By textual evidence, we mean the number of manuscripts available for a given book. The more copies are available, the better able scholars are to identify errors and to reconstruct the original. Contrariwise, the fewer number of manuscripts, the more guesswork is involved at every stage of the reconstructive process. In almost all cases, the alternative Gospels may only have a handful of copies available. For many, including the Gospels of Philip and Judas, we have only a single manuscript. The Gospel of Mary and the Gospel of Thomas both have 3 and 4 manuscripts respectively. This is typical. But compare it against the New Testament, which enjoys over 5,000 manuscripts and fragments in the original Greek alone. When one broadens the count to include Coptic, Latin, and manuscripts written in other languages, the resultant total goes over 20,000. Don't miss the point. The point is not that this disparity in manuscript availability makes the stories in the New Testament more likely to be true. Instead, it's that having the wider evidential base makes us more confident than we would be otherwise, that what we read in the back halves of our modern Bibles is substantially what the first century authors penned. A corollary is that if you think we cannot be sure that the New Testament was faithfully passed down to us over the centuries, then you would just roll your eyes when someone suggests that we know what these alternative Gospels say. But judged by the standard of what we would expect from an ancient collection of documents, the New Testament's manuscript base is spectacular. The textual evidence we have for the New Testament far outstrips what is available for many other works of antiquity that are considered trustworthy. More than this, number 7, it shows that the Apocryphal and canonical Gospels have unequal historical value. At least, they have unequal historical value when it comes to our information about the historical Jesus and the earliest years of Christianity. This is really straightforward. It's a dual function of the earlier dating for the canonical Gospels, as well as the imbalance of textual evidence. The New Testament documents, including the 4 Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, are first-century documents attested, as we saw, by thousands of ancient manuscripts and fragments. The Apocryphal Gospels, by and large, are 2nd or even 3rd century texts, with only a few and frequently incomplete manuscripts available. Not only does this mean that the information contained in the canonical Gospels was composed much closer to the events they purport to record than anything found in the documents like the Gospels of Mary or Philip that weren't composed until 100 or 200 years afterward, but it also means we can be more confident that we know what was written originally in the canonical Gospels than we can be about the alternative Gospels. All this results in the judgment that, like it or not, apart from rogue scholars and idiosyncratic perspectives, the consensus view is that the alternative Gospels, the vast majority of which are uncontroversially pseudepigraphal, are unreliable at best and totally irrelevant at worst when it comes to providing information about Jesus. Consider the words of Paul Foster, professor in New Testament language, literature, and theology at the University of Edinburgh in Scotland. Writing in the 2009 volume Apocryphal Gospels, A Very Short Introduction, published by the prestigious Oxford University Press, Dr. Foster laments the all-too-common, quote, failure to see the majority of the Apocryphal Gospels as products of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, with little historical relevance for answering questions about the historical Jesus of 1st century Judea. Now, this is not to say that these documents have no historical value whatever. For example, many of them tell us quite a lot about the 2nd and 3rd century groups who composed them. And this is bound up with our next confusion, number 8. The Apocryphal Gospels typically, though not universally, express or reflect Gnosticism. I have defined, described, and explained Gnosticism in no fewer than 3 videos on my companion channel, The Synchromystic. I refer you to those presentations for the relevant groundwork. For the basics, a convenient place to begin with little time commitment would be Gnosticism Explained in 5 minutes. For a bit more, and specifically to be able to distinguish Gnosticism from other systems with which it is often confused, see 10 Arcane Words. In that place, I sketch the differences between Gnosticism and Hermeticism, mysticism, Neoplatonism, occultism, and so on. Finally, for some of the most important incarnations of the peculiarly sex-obsessed varieties of Gnosticism, sometimes called spermo-Gnosticism, see 10 sex magic cults. Finer theological points aside, when encountering the Apocryphal Gospels, it's worth noting the frequent presence of the Gnostic theological slant. This is to say minimally that the non-canonical texts were not written by disinterested, impartial observers interested in communicating authentic, albeit contrarian, biographical facts about Jesus of Nazareth. Instead, they were written by adherents of Gnosticism. Their presumed purpose was appropriating the preeminence of the biblical figures to lend credibility to Gnostic beliefs. Now, these beliefs varied depending on the specific Gnostic sect, but often included some of the following elements: the denigration of the natural world in general, and of the human body in particular; the acquisition of special hidden knowledge with the aim of overcoming an almost terminal spiritual ignorance. In fact, ignorance was the Gnostic diagnosis of what is centrally wrong with humanity. All this contrasts with Orthodox Christianity. And by the way, when I say Orthodox, I mean right thinking, rather than orthodoxy as a branch of Christianity. All this contrasts with Orthodox Christianity, which frames its ultimate hope in the reality of our future bodily resurrections from the dead. The hope is made possible, of course, by Jesus' sacrificial death on a cross. And Jesus' atoning death affected the remediation of humanity's core deficit. Now, human beings may be ignorant, and that is repeatedly attested in news media and other places. But the Christian diagnoses humanity's core problem as something deeper, a proclivity toward evil, or in a word, sinfulness. We're turned away from God. So while it is true that none of these Gnostic beliefs would have won any sympathies among the group that developed into Catholic Christianity, still, it's not as if the alt Gospels communicate unbiased information that's free from any theological filter. Speaking of theological filtering, though, what happened? Were the hapless Gnostics hounded out of existence by the imperious proto-Orthodox? No, arguably, the Gnostics abandoned their faith. They weren't persecuted into oblivion, at least not by the church. The picture of a powerful orthodoxy brutally extinguishing free-thinking people and dissenting opinions is, at best, a partial explanation that wouldn't even begin to apply until the 4th century. Remember that it was circa AD 311 to 313 when Christianity was finally protected and minimally tolerated. It wouldn't be endorsed or given special prerogatives until years after that. But until that happened, some 300 years after Christ lived, there was no reliable, let alone coercive or powerful enforcement mechanism available to Christians. But at worst, this picture of a bullying proto-Orthodox establishment is an imaginary inversion of the pertinent history, especially during the 2nd and 3rd centuries. After all, what power do you think the much derided early heresy hunters, such as Saints Irenaeus of Smyrna or Ignatius of Antioch, enjoyed? They didn't live in luxury or get lavished with praise, preaching to sold-out crowds of devotees throughout the empire. They were put to death for their confessions of faith. In the words of Anglican scholar N.T. Wright, quote, "Let's be clear. The Christians who died in Gaul in 177 and the thousands who died around the whole Roman Empire in that century were not reading Thomas or Peter or the Gospel of Judas. They were reading, quoting, praying, and singing Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, texts which nourished their vivid faith in Jesus, not as a revealer of secret truths, but as the Lord." Going further, according to some commentators, it was in fact Gnostic Christianity that may have been in the majority position during that crucial 2nd to 3rd century interval. This naturally gives rise to a question. If Catholic Christians were the underdogs, how did they end up on top? An answer is suggested by Wright. He firstly reminds us that persecution of Christians came from the Roman establishment. At various times, emperors sought to stamp out any competition to, and thereby restore, ancient paganism, presumably along with its emperor worship. This put both Gnostics and Orthodox Christians in the proverbial crosshairs. But according to Wright, only the Orthodox persisted through these troubled times. Why? Well, recall that in Catholic theology, suffering is spiritually meaningful emulation of Christ. If you're martyred, you'll secure the reward of eternal life in heaven. On the other hand, since for most Gnostics, Christ did not really suffer, martyrdom was unnecessary. Therefore, as a rule, the Gnostics avoided persecution. They were quite content to capitulate to their surrounding culture, in which mystery religions, self-discovery, Platonic spirituality, and coded revelations of hidden truths were the stock in trade. The facts of the 2nd century persecutions and martyrdom are telling, and they give the lie in particular to the regular charge that the Orthodox were simply in the business of political power and control, while the heretics were the ones at risk. By the way, for more on Platonic spirituality, which was mentioned by N.T. Wright in the passage I just quoted, see Neoplatonism Explained in 5 Minutes. And for more, see the 1-hour deep dive, Neoplatonism, as well as the video I referenced earlier, 10 Arcane Words. It bears repeating, the people dying for the Christian faith were not Gnostics. They were Catholics. And when push came to shove, Gnostics simply shifted their focus away from Jesus and onto any of a number of other spiritual pathfinders or teachers. They turned instead to Buddha, Seth, Zoroaster, or whomever. This eclectic and exclusivist tendency to absorb and blend beliefs from various systems is called syncretism. It resulted in amalgam religions like Manichaeanism, which was hugely popular for centuries, and which preserved Gnosticism. But Christians were exclusivists and maintained fidelity to the doctrines that had been handed to them. Even faced with threats of death, Orthodox Catholics answered with the words of St. Peter, as quoted in the Gospel of John chapter 6. When Jesus was abandoned by many of his disciples, and Jesus asked the 12 apostles in verse 67, "You do not want to leave too, do you?" Simon Peter answered, "Lord, to whom shall we go? You have the words of eternal life. We have come to believe and to know that you are the Holy One of God." Thus, to believers, what Jesus actually said and did mattered. Nothing matters more than that truth. St. Paul memorably expressed this when he wrote that if Christ didn't really resurrect, then Christianity is literally worthless. Therefore, number 10, canon formation was concerned with settling definitively what Jesus actually taught. Like it or not, no ancient churchman would have stood for hand-waving dismissals of the canon formation process as having been merely an exercise in confirmation bias. That many contemporary commentators bring a thoroughgoing pre-commitment to perspectivalism and subjectivism with them when they approach the Bible says more about the prevailing intellectual climate and about their individual psychologies than it does about the integrity of the New Testament. Now, some might complain that the emerging early church was motivated to retain the canonical documents and to discard or destroy the non-canonical ones. However, this embodies a confusion about the basis upon which texts were admitted into the canon. We'll get to that in a second. But first, let me state a little acknowledged reason for the manuscript's disparity. Secrecy was part and parcel of Gnosticism. Gnostics thought of themselves as people in the know, in contradistinction to the ignorant masses. Given this, what motivation did they have for copying their own manuscripts? It's not as if they were intended for public consumption. On the contrary, those manuscripts were for initiate eyes only. Contrast this view where you keep the manuscripts for yourself secretly against Christianity, which not only represented itself as a Catholic, that is, universal religion, but also held that its founder was literally God in the flesh. If Jesus said it for real, Christians wanted to recognize it, preserve it, and publicly proclaim it. They didn't have a vendetta against Gnostics, except insofar as Gnostics misrepresented their incarnate Lord. So eventually, Christians had to get straight what books were trustworthy and which ones were not. Reliable ones were called the canon. So what is a canon anyway? In this context, canon simply means rule. Think of it as the complete authoritative list of books in the Bible. In our case, we're focused on the official table of contents, as it were, for the New Testament. Now, there are a few lingering intramural debates among Christians about the Old Testament. For example, Catholics accept 45 or 46 books, depending on whether Lamentations is combined with Jeremiah or included as a standalone book. Protestants have only 39 books in their Old Testaments. But Christians of varying hues almost universally agree on the New Testament. Across the board, Christians recognize 27 books, beginning with the Gospel according to Matthew and ending with the book of Revelation. Scholars suggest that numerous criteria, not just doctrinal agreement, were in play as the contours of the New Testament were being determined. The Church Fathers seem to view the exercise of establishing the canon as something akin to a land survey. Property lines are not based on the desires of the owner. Rather, they're determined based on plat map investigations and physical surveying techniques, such as the discovery of rebar boundary stakes. Similarly, the traditional view of the settling of the canon was that the books under review had to meet all of several criteria. Of course, the Church believes that divine inspiration is a genuine phenomenon. Therefore, yes, no text was allowed into the canon if it wasn't truly thought to have been inspired by God. And this was assessed in part by noting whether or not individual church communities, such as those in cities such as Antioch, Ephesus, and Rome, used particular books in their worship services. But beyond these criteria for canonicity, inspiration, and usage, the Church Fathers also required that any suitable inclusion genuinely go back to the ancient church. That is, it had to be antique. In other words, this would have been enough to exclude texts, such as many of the Apocryphal Gospels, that only went back to the 2nd or 3rd centuries. Regardless of their theological perspectives, these texts simply were not old enough. Relatedly, the ancient investigators also considered correct authorship credentials to be obligatory. Specifically, admitted texts had to have been written by someone who was close to Jesus and the first apostles. This is called apostolicity. Considering only the canonical 4 Gospels, it's simply a fact that the ancient church believed these to have been the works of the real-life Matthew and John, both of whom were among the 12 apostles. as well as of Mark, reportedly associated with either Saints Peter or Paul, and Luke, a disciple of the Apostle Paul. These concerns ground the judgment of Protestant scholar F. F. Bruce that it is unlikely that any book of the New Testament would have been accepted by the ancient church if it had been known that the writing was pseudonymous. Apostolicity, along with usage, that is, acceptance by various churches, helped to guarantee orthodoxy. Importantly, however, although doctrinal fidelity, that is orthodoxy, was a necessary condition for inclusion in the canon, it wasn't a sufficient condition. This one is worth pausing over. Even though doctrinal divergence was enough to exclude a book, such as, say, the overtly Gnostic Gospel of Truth, doctrinal agreement alone was not enough to justify including it in the canon. This point may surprise some viewers, but the list of excluded books contains titles such as the Didache, the Proto-Gospel of James, and the Shepherd of Hermas. And these texts largely agreed with, expanded upon, or otherwise communicated many perfectly orthodox-sounding ideas. Why were they excluded? Because they failed one or more of the other tests that the church imposed. It wasn't enough to pass a single test. The threshold was much higher than that. Now, this means that it's one thing to suppose that 21st century scholars know more about establishing authorship claims or about antiquity of the documents than they knew in the late 4th century. And probably this arrogance will be grounded, such as it is, in unquestioned acceptance of self-aggrandizing claims about modern man's superior investigation tools, or the imagined accuracy and precision of scientific methodology. But it's quite another thing to assert that the Church Fathers simply cherry-picked texts that they agreed with, or to deny the rigor of the standards that they tried to employ. And it's another thing yet again to pretend that the skeptical views of contemporary scholarship aren't in the least predicated upon sea changes in theological assumptions or worldview considerations. We've touched on some of this already, so here I'll just summarize two prominent options. For theological liberals, on the one hand, naturalism is the only game in town. To the Protestant liberal scholar, or to the Catholic modernist, it's simply unthinkable that there's any more to the formation of the Christian canon other than human beings, human politics, human psychology, and so on, working themselves out over history. On this view, the Bible as we have it is the product of a certain editorial process and a kind of socio-cultural evolution. Period. Had various conditions been otherwise, or had history gone another way other than the way it actually went, the Bible would have been different, or it wouldn't have existed at all. At the end of the day, to the liberal, to the naturalist, you can believe whatever you want. There is no God-ordained belief system, and even if God exists, there is no way for us to know him. On the traditional position, God himself superintended the relevant processes, not only for the inspiration and writing of the documents in the first place, but also for their later recognition, transmission, and ultimate canonization. Not only is the canon the unalterable record of God's dealings with mankind, but also God oversaw the determination of the canon and safeguarded its dissemination to the world. The choice is to reject the message or to accept it. St. Peter again wrote, "We have the prophetic message as something completely reliable, and you will do well to pay attention to it as to a light shining in a dark place, until the day dawns and the morning star rises in your hearts."